Hey guys, Mike here from Movie Nation.
And today we're going through a 2007 crime, drama, thriller movie called Funny Games. The opening scene shows Anne and George Farber with their son, Georgie, traveling in their car with a boat attached to the back. As they travel, the couple plays a game where they each have to guess the type of song playing from the car's sound system. Anne comes out on top after winning with 3 points to 2. The family soon arrives at their lake house with their dog, Lucky, with them too. Their next-door neighbor, Fred, is seen with two young men, Peter and Paul. They find Fred reacting somewhat awkwardly. Anne calls out to Fred to help with unloading the boat and he says he's coming. Upon entering, the family starts unpacking and Lucky keeps running around the house. Moments later, Fred arrives with Paul and George goes to welcome them. Fred introduces Paul as his business associate. As they talk, Lucky keeps barking at Paul furiously but George tries to calm the dog down. Fred and Paul then go with George and Georgie to help them in unloading the boat onto the river. Fred and Paul leave afterward. After they leave, George and Georgie stay outside by the lake, tending to their boat. Georgie asks his father why Fred was behaving so strangely. Inside the house, Anna's in the kitchen preparing a meal while making a call too. Georgie comes inside to ask for a sharp knife and Anne gives it to him and he takes his leave. Just then, Georgie comes back to the kitchen and tells Anne that someone is at the door. Anne goes to the door and finds Peter waiting at the door. Peter introduces himself and Anne welcomes him in. Peter then asks for some eggs. He says that one of the neighbors, Mrs. Thompson, sent him to get the eggs from her. Anne opens the cupboard and hands Peter some eggs. As Peter is about to leave, he clumsily drops the egg but Anne says it's okay and returns to the kitchen to get a napkin to clean up the mess. Anne then returns to the kitchen to give Peter another set of eggs but Peter accidentally knocks Anne's phone into the sink filled with water. Anne acts a little upset and quickly gives Peter the eggs, telling him to leave. Peter apologizes for his clumsiness and leaves afterward. Soon afterward she hears Lucky barking and finds Peter and Paul inside together. Lucky had jumped on Peter, causing him to break the second batch of eggs. Paul says Peter is very scared of dogs. Paul spots the golf clubs standing in the corner and says he is a fan of golf. Paul begs Anne that he would like to try out the golf clubs outside and Anne hesitantly agrees. In the boat, Georgie and George hear Lucky barking furiously and George decides to go check it out. Back in the house, Peter and Paul request more eggs but Anne, who is now frustrated, tells them to leave. The two men insist that she must give them eggs before they can leave but George arrives while the trio argues. Peter and Paul then try to explain what the issue is to George. Georgie also arrives during the argument. Shortly afterward, George tells Anne to give them the eggs but Anne suggests that George throws the young men out. Anne leaves the living room in anger and goes upstairs. Following his wife's suggestion, George asks Peter and Paul to leave but they insist they collect the egg. In annoyance, George slaps Paul and in retaliation, Peter breaks one of George's legs with the golf club. Georgie tries to defend his father but he is subdued easily. Just then, Anne comes downstairs to find out that the two young men have taken her family hostage. Peter and Paul tell Anne to help George up and she does. George begs them to leave but the duo says they would like to play a game. Paul brings out a golf ball and asks George what it is. George answers correctly and Paul asks why he hasn't played the ball yet. He then says that Anne should try and find the family dog. Paul guides Anne on a hunt to find the family's dog, which he had terminated with George's golf club. Shortly afterward, their neighbors, the Thompsons, come to visit. The Thompsons, which includes Betsy, Robert, and Betsy's sister-in-law, all came to say hello to the family. Anne receives them at the dock and she introduces Paul to them as a friend. She also tells them that George is inside the house resting. After saying their greetings, the Thompsons take their leave. Upon returning to the house, the two young men try to apologize to George, but when neglected by George and Anne, they beat them. Minutes later, while trying to have a conversation with the family, Paul ridicules Peter's weight and lack of intelligence and describes a number of contradicting stories about Peter's past. Soon afterward, Paul asks if George or Anne wants to bet that they will be alive by 9 o'clock in the morning, and says that he and Peter are betting they will not be. George insists that the young men are trying to scare them. He then begs them to take anything they want and leave. The duo starts complimenting how beautiful Anne is and Paul suggests if Peter would like to have a go with her. During the games, Peter and Paul put Georgie's head in a bag and ask Anne to take off her clothes. Georgie is nearly suffocated until George asks Anne to follow the men's instructions. As Anne cries, she slowly takes off her clothes. After seeing her, Paul tells her to get dressed again. When released from the bag, Georgie escapes the house with the help of his parents. Georgie goes upstairs and climbs down from the window. Back in the house, Paul is angrily tying Anne's legs and hands. After he is done, he asks Peter to look after the couple while he tries to find Georgie. Georgie manages to climb over the house fence and makes his way through the shallow part of the river onto Fred's house. Georgie looks back and finds Paul closing in on him. Georgie quickly runs inside the house as he breathes heavily and shakes out of fear. Back in the house, Peter tells the couple that they are suffering because they were not ready to give them some eggs. Peter then goes to the kitchen to get the eggs. Anne quickly jumps up and goes over to George so he can untie her. Peter returns from the kitchen with the eggs. He is upset and throws Anne to the floor, and in the process, the eggs break again. He starts to clean the carpet and says Anne and Georgie are in big trouble now. Anne comes over to him and starts begging him to let them go. She cries and says if he releases them, she will tell no one of what happened. Peter tells her to stop crying because she is degrading herself and he feels for her, but unfortunately, he can't release them. Now in Fred's apartment, Georgie is trying his best to hide from Paul, who is desperately searching for him. Georgie sees bloodstains all over the house. Seconds later, Georgie finds a shotgun lying around and he picks it up. While searching for Georgie, Paul goes to the tape and plays a tune to put more fear in Georgie. Paul soon finds Georgie and Georgie threatens him not to come any closer. Paul then directs Georgie on how to operate the shotgun. Afterward, he tells Georgie to shoot him, but the gun fails to go off and he gives Georgie an evil stare. Back in the house, Peter is busy watching the TV while waiting for Paul. Minutes later, Paul arrives with Georgie with him. Georgie runs over to hug his tied-up mother. His father cries silently because Paul was able to capture his son. Georgie then tells Anne that the young men have terminated the occupants of Fred's apartment. Paul tells the couple that Georgie tries to terminate him with the shotgun and he is passed because of that. The men play a new game, saying whoever gets counted out will be shot. Paul asks Anne how old she is but refuses to answer. He and Peter try to take a guess and they conclude she is 35 years old. Paul then says he is hungry and decides to go to the kitchen to find something to eat. While Paul is in the kitchen getting something to eat, Georgie panics and runs, which results in Peter shooting and terminating him. Paul berates Peter for being trigger-happy, and the two men decide to briefly leave. Anna goes over to the TV and switches it off. She and George cry over the loss of their child and they decide to escape from the house. Upon seeing that he is a liability, George tells Anne to leave without him and try to find help. George tells her to put on some clothes and shoes so that she will be able to run faster. Anne then goes over to her phone and finds out that it's on. She tries to call the police but the line isn't connecting. She keeps trying but all her attempts are unsuccessful. She plugs the hairdryer so she can make use of it in drying the wet phone. George then tells Anne that they are wasting time and she has to leave immediately. Anne makes use of the pliers to cut the fence in order to escape from the house. Meanwhile, George desperately tries to make a call on the malfunctioning phone. Anne runs to the road screaming for help. Anne fails to find help, only to be recaptured by Peter and Paul, who brings her back to the house. After puncturing George with a knife, Peter and Paul tell Anne to say a prayer before making a choice for her husband. A painful and prolonged death with a little knife, or a quick and brutal death with a big shotgun. Anne tries to tell them that she doesn't know any prayers, but Paul teaches her some prayers. While Paul is talking, Anne seizes the shotgun on the table in front of her and terminates Peter. An enraged Paul collects the shotgun and starts looking for the television remote. Upon finding it, he rewinds the last occurrences back to a moment before Anne grabs the shotgun. On the do-over, Paul snatches the shotgun away before she can grab it and admonishes her, saying she is not allowed to break the rules. Paul then shoots and terminates George. The two men then bounce, gag, and take Anne to the family's boat. Anne tries to free herself but is caught by Paul and Peter. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, Paul nonchalantly pushes her into the water to drown, thus winning their bet. The movie comes to an end with Paul knocking on the door of the Thompsons' house and requesting some eggs. Paul glances at the camera with a smirk and the scene cuts away. Thanks for watching, guys.